Thank you, everyone. Welcome to our Azure Open Source Day Q&A. For the folks here in person and the folks online, we do apologize for the delay. We've been having a few technical difficulties, making sure the whole thing works, because we're trying to bring in guests who have joined us remotely, guests who very kindly joined us in person, and trying to get your questions answered. So, yep, apologies for the delay. Hope you're still with us. So welcome to this Azure Open Source Day Q&A. I'm hoping everybody watched the Azure Open Source Day 2 days ago. It was a very cool event. I very much enjoyed that. We are going to be putting a link to that in the chat. So if you want to catch up with it, if you didn't catch it live, you can catch it in the chat. Now, we're here to answer questions. So we've had some questions submitted already, but we're here to answer your questions. So folks in the room, if you have questions, this is your chance to get them answered. And folks online, we're going to be monitoring you through the YouTube chat. So if you have any questions, ask your questions and we'll take them to our speakers. Now, this is a Microsoft Reactor event. It is managed and governed by the Microsoft Code of Conduct. So please, folks in the room, behave yourselves. Folks online in the chat, behave yourselves. We have an absolute no tolerance policy to Code of Conduct breaches. Be kind, don't be mean, don't be nasty to people, don't do things you shouldn't do. And if you do, we will get you banned from all Microsoft events. We have a zero tolerance policy on this, so do not test us. We have a very large legal department. So I cannot emphasize enough that you must follow our code of conduct, and we do not tolerate any breaches. So with that, I would like to hand over to our guests for introductions. And because of our technical difficulties, we're down to one mic. So this is going to be passed around. So please introduce yourselves.
Hi there, I'm Brendan Burns. I was a co-founder of the Kubernetes open source project, and I'm currently corporate vice president for the Azure Kubernetes service and management services in the Azure cloud platform.
Hey there, I'm Aaron Crofus. I'm a senior product manager on the Azure Open Source Incubations team. I was one of the first PMs to get going up on the Dapper, or Distributed Application Runtime project, and now looking ahead to some other really cool projects, which keep an eye out next couple months.
Awesome, thank you. Then I guess online, Jake, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Jake Lundberg, Field CTO at HashiCorp.
Awesome, thank you. And Takuto, please introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. I'm a product marketing manager for Azure AI team and specifically focusing on Azure machine learning.
Awesome, awesome, thank you. So the focus we had on the Azure Open Source Day was a mixture of open source and AI. So how can we use open source to build the next generation of products, and how we can mix in some AI to support that. And so the purpose of today is to put the hardest questions we can think of to our panelists. So I've got a few here I'm going to kick off with. Obviously, folks in the room, feel free to chime in with your questions, and then folks online, just drop your questions in the chat. So first question, this is actually one from me, and this is something that's quite dear to my heart. So here at the Microsoft Reactor, we run a number of events, and recently we've been running some open source boot camps where we focus on getting folks who are new to open source upskilled in Git, GitHub, open source, and particularly how to collaborate, how to work together to make contributions to projects. And that applies either open source or in the workplace. So one example we had recently is we had a 12-year-old come join us, and the team he was working with very kindly they dove right in and they explained concepts. They supported his learning, so they got him up to speed really, really quickly. So I guess an open question for all of you really about this is, how do you see the value of open source contributions, particularly around collaboration as well, that can help folks find jobs? So the skill of knowing how to collaborate on open source projects, how can that help folks find jobs? You know, we are at a time where there's been a lot of layoffs throughout the industry. There's a lot of people who are looking for work. So how can they put themselves ahead of the game by collaborating on open source projects?
Yeah, I'll take this one. I actually started out with a quick story. I actually owe my career at Microsoft to a very similar event that we had on my college campus, like a hackathon, like a weekend long, kind of get mentors and people experienced or new with coding together. And so I had never really touched any sort of coding, any sort of, like, I was very passionate about technology. But over the course of a weekend, I had some like mentors who are in the space sit down with me, teach me, okay, this is how you get started. This is the compiler. This is how you can start to write some of your first programs. And so a lot of the like reference material I was looking at and learning from, specifically with iOS development with Objective-C, was GitHub repos and open source projects and all of that. So over the course of a weekend, I not only learned the technical side, which is here's how you like reference existing open source projects and all of that, but also here's how you create a GitHub repo and like contribute to that. And I even have those original repos still on my public GitHub account. And but with that, it also came, how do you pitch your idea and pitch that product idea? And I learned a lot about it's not always about the most technologically advanced code that you can write, but how can you actually pitch that to either a panel of judges or nowadays in the workplace, customers. And so it actually worked its way out where we ended up getting first place, not because we had the most technologically advanced project and the most lines of code, but we told the best story and has solved the biggest problem. So yeah, looking ahead now, kind of to you're asking about today, how can this help us kind of find opportunities and work, which is not only can you learn a lot and like get experience in the industry, but very often like your GitHub account and like your GitHub history can be your resume. You can point to, here's my contribution history, not just number of commits, and because it's not about how often or how much, but here's the experiences that I've had, like how I've most of all made impact, impacted open source projects, impacted customers. Here's what I learned from that. And so, yeah, I use my GitHub profile all the time to show here's these few blocks or the Dapper days, and here's more recently it's some other projects, and all the way back in like 2010 is like that first project, that first commit. So yeah, the GitHub profile and kind of all that experiences has really changed my life. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, I definitely echo what was said from a interview or hiring manager's perspective, which is, oftentimes these days I will go into an interview with someone and I don't need to ask any of the coding questions or any of the, the technical questions, because I can see it in the GitHub. I can see it in the contribution. So I just second what was said.
Awesome. Thank you. Jake, any comments?
Yeah. Fix bugs, I guess. I don't the old standard, get into the open source world, right? Find some issues, maybe contribute that way. But I guess there's so many different ways. Obviously, having your own GitHub repo in which you work with other folks and collaborate on different projects is great, and the ability for you to be able to highlight that work that you've done, but also just consuming things from other people's repos and jamming on that, maybe working on it, finding a new way to take that in a different direction, and just find a project in which you're attaching to. I sort of joke about the bugs thing because that was kind of the old standard, how to get into open source stuff, but that is a way, even like documentation, like helping to clear up some of the crusty areas where people don't have a good understanding, or contribute to the core JS the core JS project or something along those lines. But yeah, I think there's a lot of that opportunity. From a HashiCorp side of things, we have a lot of public repositories for like Terraform modules. If you're kind of new to that and you want to jam on that and publish those type of things, you can get some fame in that area as well, just specific to our side of things. But sort of just along the same lines that everybody else has, just get your code out there, publish it somewhere so people can see it, and then have that history of working on things, hopefully iterating and getting better over time.
So again, is that awareness? Is that doing it in public? People can see you. Yeah. Takuto, any thoughts?
Yeah, +1 to everyone's thoughts. I mean, open source is integral part for the AI for sure. Like you can't do AI without open source. So there's going to be a tons of opportunities, job opportunities if you're really strong at open source technologies. Things like PyTorch, TensorFlow, Onyx Runtime. Those open source frameworks are out there, for past couple of years. So there's going to be a lot of, given the excitement we have around, ChatGPT and generative AI, there's going to be for sure that you have to be, equipped with the open source technology like PyTorch to build your own models with your own data. So for sure, there's going to be tons of opportunities to find your jobs if you're very strong at open source technology in the AI space for sure.
Yeah, so it's not just about contributing, but also just demonstrating your strength in using those particular products as well. That can help you. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. So question of one of the things that was mentioned in the session on open source was about the sustainability of open source projects. So you've got a lot of people contributing, whether they're volunteers, they're making their first contributions, or whether it's kind of professionals in the workplace, people have built their companies out of it. A lot of people contribute towards open source. We need to think about the sustainability aspect of it. There's that old, I think it's an XKCD cartoon where you have this whole stack of modern cloud infrastructures, depends on a tiny little block that the thankless person in Nebraska has been maintaining for the past 20 years. So obviously we've got GitHub sponsors, which is a way where people can sponsor open source projects. But do you feel that GitHub sponsors goes far enough, or do you think there's more things we could do? Or do you think the rise of licenses like the Redis source available licenses, that's going to allow companies to develop in the open but still have a sustainable business model?
Well, I mean, I guess I have a little bit of a biased perspective on this. I don't think, I mean, to be completely honest, I don't think that the tip jar sponsors style stuff, I mean, it's nice, but I'm not sure that it's going to be sufficient for most people. I think the truth is that sustainability for open source comes from operating it for other people. And certainly that's what we do in Azure. That's what a lot of people do in various public clouds, or even in our open source partners like HashiCorp running, HashiCloud. I think that's really the most sustainable model, is an open source for all the values of community and collaboration. But the truth is that running software that in a reliable way is hard, and something that people are very willing to pay people to do. And so that's my feeling, is that's the route to sustainability for open source projects.
So yeah, Jake, it sounds like you've got a few.
Yeah, well, and I think this is one of the biggest tricks about the open source community, is that if you're brand new to something and you have an idea, and nobody else is really doing that kind of thing, and lots of folks kind of glom onto it, how do you monetize that and how you do this? I was joking about the Core.js piece earlier, but there are cases that are like that where, like you said, the XKCD case, where you have this very fragile area that folks are working on things, and not everybody is really familiar with that. And, not to say that we're the perfect model, but I think having that ability to put some financial backing behind something, to allow the community to work on it. But then, like Brandon's saying, is that to really have that ability to, from an enterprise perspective, or just, from folks who are consuming this for their businesses and whatnot, whether it's enterprise or just small businesses that are there, making it a lot easier for them to consume, whether they're cloud products or like a SaaS-based product like we have at the HTTP, or any of the rest of the SaaS price product that are based off from open source software. And the trick is, like, how do you get to that point, from like the ideation point to everything? And if you listen to like somebody like Michio Hashimoto, he spent years on the circuit basically promoting Vagrant within the HashiCorp community, and it wasn't until that project really took off that became a viable success. And so, to some extent, there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that comes with promoting an open source project. But in the case where something has a tremendous amount of relevance to the community, it's highly likely that the community will support it. And then you have that ability to then say, okay, maybe we can get funding for it. We can put some paid bodies behind it. And then we don't end up with, something like Core.js, where, there's one developer who's reaching out, sort of begging the community for money, which is, kind of ridiculous, if you ask me.
Because I guess the problem is you've got to pound the streets, as it were, as you're saying, like the Vagrant project. You've got to put that time in. You've got to put a lot of effort in up front to get your project to the point where it is monetizable. But if you build something that's small and doesn't sell, like curl, for example, how do you fund a small project like curl? It's not something you can sell, but there's somebody who's devoted the last 21 years or something to building that project. So how do you fund something small like that?
Well, I think there's a cultural thing too, is that like, I think we have all these core projects that are part of it. We at HashiCorp have the same thing. There's fundamental parts of our software that are open source projects. It was great. We had an outage with one of our customers back last year, and it just happened to be that we pushed over a piece of software that wasn't designed to scale to that level. And then you sort of have to look at that, like, how do we support those particular developers that we have, core pieces of our software that are relying on those things. And to some extent, I almost feel like from a vendor's perspective, as it begins to take off, the rising tide raises all ships. And we should be able to say, hey, look, if you have software that is being consumed by massively commercial products, I do think there should be some kind of a share model that that agrees with that. And I think that's more of a cultural shift than anything else, to say we do have these core libraries. Should we have some kind of microtransaction type of deal that we help folks out with, that that are a part of that core software project? And then where does it go? I mean, a lot of our stuff is written in Go. Do we pay Google for for all the stuff that we've done within the Go project? I'm not sure if that's if that's the way that we go, but how do we actually share with folks that are so critical to our software environment? And I think that's a cultural shift that we should expect, that we would sort of raise the all the ships with the tide as it goes.
It's almost like an in-app purchase model in some ways, that every time you deploy an app to Azure, you have to spend 1 cent on getting this particular tool and 2 cents on this particular tool, and then all feed down to the creators.
I mean, I think it's a little bit, I mean, I don't know. I feel like it's a little bit thorny to get it hung up on money, I guess. I think that everybody, I guess from my perspective, I think everybody should just be aware that open source is something that a developer can walk away from at any time, right? And so I'd flip it around a little bit and say that, like, if you're using a piece of open source software, in some sense, you're gambling on the fact that the maintainer is going to be there, and if they walk away, you should know that you have to step up, right? Like, I think that's sort of the way that I've looked at it. Whenever, like, when you adopt a piece of open source software, you are making a commitment to that piece of software that it's going to stay healthy, and that you're responsible for keeping it healthy at some level. And money can be part of that, but I think also, like, teams, and I think we take this message out to a lot of our enterprise users who are maybe newer to open source, and say, like it's not a free lunch. Like, you don't just suddenly get all this software and have a bunch of people out in the community, in quotes, writing software for you, right? You have to be prepared to step up, and maybe it's a commons, right, where I'm not going to work on curl, but maybe I'll go work on some other library, and it all kind of works out. But I think people should just go in it with eyes wide open, that, like, it's not a free lunch. I don't know, but I think trying to figure out how you pay someone to maintain curl is maybe the wrong, like, a royalty model for curl is probably never going to work. But everybody who uses curl should understand that, like, there's a little bit of an IOU there that some human is going to have to step up and do at some point. So I don't know.
But I agree with you. I just think that there's sort of that cultural, not ignorance isn't the way to say it, just kind of ignoring the fact that there are lots of other folks that are sort of expectations that you might have, either carrying the torch or sharing some kind of finance with these folks. Again, I don't, royalty isn't really the right way of going about this. I agree with you on that either. But how do we think about either what's the cultural shift that we have to get to, that our expectations that free software is free. I mean, it's open source software, and I think that the mistake that a lot of folks make is that, yeah, you can get it for free, but it isn't actually something that's free. And again, I think that's a cultural shift that we almost have to, as leaders within the industry, to say, look, this isn't something that's actually free. There are some expectations that if you're going to consume from these people, that you may have to step up to the plate, like you're saying, or you may have to figure out a way of supporting those engineers in the long run, because they're so critical for your environment. So, like I said, I don't know how to solve the problem culturally. Like, I get it, I donate to certain things that are out there, but again, expecting everybody to do that seems ridiculous. But at the same time, like, how do we shift the culture? How do we make it so that people understand that we should support folks who have critical software that helps drive everything that we have around us?
I could almost think of maybe companies offering 20% time and spend that 20% contributing back to the open source projects that you depend upon. If you can't do cash, then have time. Can you get that kind of culture of, for every open source project you use, can you at least put one engineering day back to the project, maybe? Let's say that's kind of a cultural shift, has to come from up top, because if you're asking leadership to give 20% time of a whole team of engineers, that's usually a hard sell if it's just to get something that you can get anyway for free.
Yeah, but I think it is worth saying. I mean, we do exactly this. It's not 20% time, but I have a dedicated team that focuses on upstream open source, right? I have a dedicated team that goes and builds and builds in open source, not because it's charity, but because we need to be making these communities healthy. And so I do think we do acknowledge that, especially in the cloud, we do acknowledge that need. We need to definitely make sure all of our customers who use open source know that too. And that is a bit of a cultural change at times. But I totally agree that it's really about people who use it and being willing to invest time. So.
Awesome, thank you. And so just a shout out to everyone who who's watching this. If you've got any questions for our panelists, please drop those questions in the chat. Same as the room here. If anyone's got a question, stick your hand up. We will get a no. Oh, I thought it was going to be a question there. Stick your hand up if you've got a question. So sticking with this kind of idea of contributing towards open source as teams of folks like at Microsoft who contribute towards open source. I've got a question about Dapper here. So Dapper started off as a Microsoft project. It's now been moved under the Linux Foundation, I believe. Yep, CNCF. So why was this moved out of Microsoft? What's in it for Microsoft by kind of giving this away? And then kind of investing in developing in the open. And then what are the learnings we've got from doing this that other vendors could actually use to kind of take their products and open them up and hand them over to a foundation? One for you, maybe?
Yeah, no, I was lucky I was able to join the Azure Incubations team right when Dapper was like right at the heat of its development in the summer of 2019. Yeah, so when we were getting started with Dapper, the goal was, first of all, to help microservice developers write microservices. At the time, Kubernetes was becoming the big technology that a lot of enterprises and small businesses were moving to. And a lot of like monolithic apps were now all of a sudden being split off into microservices, and they found that, well, service invocation, pub sub, secrets management, state management, all of these things that more or less you'd take for granted in a monolithic app where it's on the same machine are now distributed amongst lots of nodes. So was the motivation behind Dapper. Now, we had a couple options. We could either build this into something like Service Fabric and Microsoft, or we can make it a paid product within Microsoft or Azure. But then all of a sudden, your customers are very narrowed to just those Microsoft, and you don't really get to any sort of what we wanted was the community, which is, we were a very small team. There was 3 or 4 developers working on Dapper at the very beginning. And we knew that to really reach the ambitions that we wanted, and to just make sure that as a community or as an industry, we were having this impact on microservices development. When we launched, within the first our first blog post at the time was, we are moving to open governance with maintainerships. We are moving to a lot like a steering committee, a technical steering committee to really put together what does it mean, not just Microsoft flipping a switch to open source saying, look at what we're doing, but more of a, hey, here is where we believe microservices development's heading. Come do it with us. We welcomed, on our steering committee today, we have our partners with Alibaba and with Intel, and even small startups like Diagrid, which are also maintainers of a lot of our different repos in our steering committee. And so together we were able to say, let's not just solve microservice development for the Service Fabric developer in Microsoft, but let's solve and really make an impact to our customers and to the industry across the board. And so that's why with Dapper, you saw at the very beginning, we had components for AWS, for GCP, for Azure, for everything from CouchDB to Mongo to Redis and all of that. And it's really grown. The most recent release, we had 1.10, we had 101 contributors. I think it was the first time we were above 100. And the vast majority of those were actually non-Microsoft, which was really cool. I was talking with a couple of the maintainers from the Dapper project the other day. And we've seen, just explosive growth where we could not have had any of that. Dapper would not be the project it is today without just that amazing community of, at this point, majority non-Microsoft people as well. So it's been a really cool experience seeing that really take off and grow, which was thanks to the community at the end of the day.
So I guess the second part of the question was, how could other vendors benefit from this? So obviously we've got this great idea. We've got it out there. It allows people to build across multiple clouds, which obviously a lot of large companies do have a multi-cloud setup. Especially, so how can other vendors benefit from this? How can we take thought leadership in this space to get folks to do something similar?
Well, I mean, I think the truth is that every customer that we see is a multi-cloud customer, whether it's for regulatory reasons or business reasons or any other reason. there are very few customers who are exclusively in any one particular cloud. And so when they're looking to adopt things to make their developers' lives easier, they're looking for things that run on all of the different clouds. And that's true for us. It's true for every other cloud out there. And so I think one of the motivations we really see from a lot of people for open sourcing their projects is it's really the only way to get true adoption these days, right? Many of our customers who we talk to, they simply aren't interested in talking about stuff if it isn't possible to run it on their own infrastructure or on other public cloud infrastructure in addition to Azure. And I think the same calculus is true for other public clouds as well. And then I think the other thing that is true is that we can collaborate with each other much more easily on undifferentiated heavy lifting when it's done in the context of a vendor neutral open source foundation, right? And so I think the other piece is like, and actually our customers, I see the same thing in our customers, right? You may have two customers who are competitors, but if you put an open source project out under the CNCF, they're then comfortable working with each other in a world where they would never be comfortable working with each other directly, right? And so I think there's a lot of benefit, especially in the places where it's just work that needs to be done, whether it's security or other just kind of mission critical, but not necessarily places where we're going to differentiate, where getting to a single solution for everyone in the industry is the most important thing you can drive towards. Like the only way that happens is open source.
Okay, so I guess to a comment you made earlier, Jake, about a rising tide lifts all ships. It's that kind of idea that if we all get into this mindset of building these vendor neutral type products, we build things in foundations, we're all going to lift each other up. So we're all going to benefit. That kind of mentality.
You see this in other areas. I mean, maybe other people want to comment, but you can see that in, like, for example, in the AI space, right? Where the consolidation on Onyx or the consolidation on TensorFlow or PyTorch have really helped sort of move the conversation past how do you run a model and into, you know, more interesting things that you can do with models.
So yeah, Takuto, do you want to speak to that really? Because obviously being involved in the AI space, how are you finding the different AI models that are being built by the different vendors that have been open source? Are you seeing this rising tide lifts all ships?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the AI models, like there are like so many AI models out there, and then I think one of the things that we just called out in the event is Hugging Face. It's a very unique, platform that I would say for data, open data science platform where you can actually share your models, even like the large AI models that one of the big vendors like Microsoft and Meta actually have built in the past. It's actually on the Hugging Face where you can actually use just take them, and then with the announcement that we just made at the Open Source Day, you can actually take that model and then use your own data to fine tune the models, and then make it better before bringing it to the production. So those so many like large AI models that are built by so many vendors out there are actually now you can access those models very easily, and then bring into your own production workload so that you can just leverage take advantage of those large AI models that are built by so many other vendors.
So thinking about if you've got like a multi-cloud strategy, just by using the tooling from Hugging Face, you've got the same thing you can deploy to all your different clouds. You're not kind of locked into one, which is the situation that a lot of folks don't want to have.
Yep.
Awesome. Now, you may have noticed a small lineup change. So unfortunately, Aaron had to go. So could you take a moment to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sarah Novotny, and I lead open source strategy for Microsoft. I've also done a lot of work in the Kubernetes community and with the Cloud Native Computing Foundation and foundations across all of open source. Oh, and Nginx. Actually, I was also at Nginx in early days.
Thank you very much. And you actually led the Open Source Day panel a couple of days ago, and all your questions were generated by ChatGPT, I believe, which I thought was pretty cool. These questions are not generated by ChatGPT. These are human-generated questions. But I do have a ChatGPT question. So one about ChatGPT, that is, not one that's generated by ChatGPT. So one comment that was made was, there's obviously, we get a lot of spam in open source. especially around things like Hacktoberfest. I know there's a lot of they've done a lot of work to kind of reduce that spam over the years. We do get a lot of spam, and with the rise of tools like ChatGPT, we are getting potential for a lot more spam, a lot more kind of auto-generated results. But one huge upside of tools like ChatGPT is for accessibility. So for folks for whom English may not be their first language, for a repo that's in English, for example, taking advantage of these large language models, they can build up a question or a pull request and explain that in a way that they may not be able to do because of their natural first language. So how do you see the management of this? This is a question for whoever wants to take this. How do you see the management of these issues coming in? Are we just going to go, oh, we think that's ChatGPT, we're not going to answer it? Or are we going to treat those with grace? There could be accessibility issues. How are we going to manage this? Sarah wants to take it? Okay.
I'll dive in and I'll say this because open source broadly is really dealing with this question today. There are a number of conversations about where using generative AI is acceptable and where it's not. And of course, most of the industry, and Microsoft specifically, believe that keeping a human in the loop is the right answer with AI, and making sure that while we may generate text, we then have a human reviewer, a human person who is engaging with that. Now, that said, we're very early days on all of this, and I think we're going to find over this next year that what those social norms are and how we identify, say, text that has been partially generated or generated and engaged with will be identified.
I will say, though, that I'm actually really optimistic on the other side of this, which is, today in a lot of large projects, there's a lot of issues out there that just founder and don't get attention, and because they're poorly formed, because if I'm going through an issue list and it doesn't have a good repro and I don't quite understand what somebody's trying to ask for, I'm more likely to just not respond than I am to ask for more details. And similarly, we see pull requests that maybe they're failing CI/CD, or maybe and it requires somebody to say, oh, you need to run this formatter to lint the code correctly. And then, so I think there's a lot of opportunity for more intelligent automation to handle some of that basic triage, basic understanding, basic summarization of what the PR is trying to do, that will actually relieve the load that a lot of open source projects face. So maybe I'm just the naive optimist, but I really do think that we're gonna see a lot of benefit from those kinds of chat models, specifically around PR and issue management.
Awesome, Jake. It sounds like you have thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with both of them are saying, and I agree a lot with what Sarah's saying, is that these are tools to help accelerate our workflows. And I have a military background. We call it force multiplication, and the idea is that you have much more leverage as a person, having something that can help you sort of recognize particular patterns or help accelerate your ability to fix bugs, like Brendan's talking about, or the ability to generate things to 90% or 80% of where you need to be. I don't know that Chat GPT talks in my style. So like if I'm doing something like writing a paper or something like that, I don't know that it has enough data to generate something in my voice. I haven't tried it out yet. I should probably do that. But more so is like, yeah, if it gives me 80% of the copy that I need, and I can put my own touch on it, that leaves me free to do other things as well. And hopefully those are productive things. They may not. I could be disc golf or something along those lines, or Rocket League or something. But I don't know that there's anything super bad about that. I don't. When you asked the question though, it was more how do we detect that ChatGPT is there? And to be honest with you, I think the biggest problem that I've seen from a lot of pushback is just that it BS's a lot. Like it makes things that sound like really, really good. And with code, it's different because you can test code and see whether or not the thing comes out the other end. But with like language or references or something like that, that's where that human element comes in, which Hera was talking about. And I think that's the important part. But also on the backside is that it sounds like we have a potential to have these dangerous feedback loops where if something was generated by ChatGPT and then sort of ingressed by that, then it's like you don't have progress because humans naturally just kind of change by style, and You know, I mean, we're not dressed like we were in the 80s or anything like that. There's just these little differences of mimetics that we have within our environments. And I think feeding that into the models to allow them to grow to look more human over time, I think it's okay. I mean, I don't know that I'm overly worried about it than anything, except for, you know, deep fakes or some weird stuff, you know, where, you know, I get a phone call that sounds like my wife telling me to, you know, pass my PayPal number to her or something like that. Like, well, you should just get that on your phone. Well, I didn't get it. So send it to me. Like if it fools me there, like stuff like that, I'm slightly worried about. But again, I like the concept of just, you know, sort of having a lot more leverage as a human by using these tools to help us get past some of, you know, the minutia that, you know, maybe we were dealing with on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, and Takuto, any thoughts?
Yeah, I want to. So I have to leave in a couple of minutes, but I want to really briefly touch on the accessibility. You know, how not just ChatGPT, but, you know, AI in general can actually increase accessibility. So actually, you know, we have so many, you know, capabilities in Azure AI. Where, for example, you have like content reading that is actually embedded in Microsoft products like Outlook, Edge, and PowerPoint. You have like read aloud feature. So if you can, you know, just if you're blind, but you can still hear, you know, what the, you know, contents in the PowerPoint is just, you know, saying. And then also you have like capabilities like you know, Microsoft Translator, for example. You know, you can actually you know, use Translator and then speak with the people who have who may speak the different languages. So, you know, those types of capabilities are powered by Azure, you know, AI, and we're actually adding more capabilities to simply really increase the accessibility that is powered by the AI.
It's one of the big powerful areas in the space, isn't it? Is that it opens up the world to more people. You know, you want to have people to contribute towards your open source project for whom English is not their first language. Then they can use tools like Translator to actually translate it into their chosen language, and then they can write their issue in, you know, Cantonese, for example, and then have it translated to English, and then submit it. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of power there for accessibility. So in the room, do we have any questions? Yes. Okay, I'm just going to come over with the microphone, just so we make sure the question gets to our audience online.
To follow up on the ChatGPT thing, should we even be concerned about whether it's a machine we're asking the question or a human? Because don't we see in the long run that's kind of equitable, that, you know, we will have machines and human working together?
Sorry, this one microphone thing is problematic.
Yeah.
You know, in other places we've had throwable microphones.
Yeah.
Just saying, I
Like
throw the cube around. I mean, I actually kind of agree, right? Like, honestly, I treat every issue the same, you know, and even the bad ones, I try and help people. Like, even the ones where people aren't, they're just out for help vampiring, I try and help them anyway. Although sometimes I give up, right? So I guess like what I would say is that in general, assuming it doesn't add too much load, I think people will probably just treat them the same. But I do think that there are concerns about spam are legit, right? Like there's only so many hours in the day, and you know, this is why Hacktober got the bad reputation that it did, and we still see this kind of gamification of like, I mean, we've had big discussions, I mean, even before ChatGPT. We had really big discussions about like, are we going to merge typo fixes? Because there's people who will go and run a grammar checker across your markdown documents and send you a PR. And it, like, I think I'm in the like, well, it is a fix, right? So we should take it. Like, I think I'm in that camp, but I also do understand that there is this gamification where people get rewarded based on how many commits did you merge, or how many, like, and it's not really looking at the quality of the commits. And I don't necessarily want to support that part of the industry. It's a complicated question, I think, even beyond ChatGPT.
Sorry, Jake. Yeah, sounds like you may have comments.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think in any system that we have, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it goes back probably as long as we're humans. There's always somebody who's trying to game the system and one up somebody. But I think this comes into the concept of community. And in some sense, it's made harder by remote work, but we still have the ability to like see each other on these screens. We get to work with each other and sort of chat with each other through through different media interfaces that we have, be it like BBSs or Slack or whatever those things are. And I feel like in the long run, it's hard to game the real relationships that we have with each other. And I think this is maybe like it might be one of those interesting pushbacks. Like I have an 8-year-old kid, and like, it's highly likely that the way that she interacts with folks is going to be slightly different than the way the teenagers or young adults are doing today, just because they want to stand out and do something slightly differently. But I still think that those bonds that I see her forming and that I'm still forming with folks that are there are collaborative in nature in some way, that even if you're trying to game the system, you can kind of tell usually if somebody's gaming the system, because what it is that they're outputting is, yeah, sure, it's typo fixes or something along those lines. And sure, those contributions are great, but if it's 1,000 typo fixes and that's all the interactions that you have with somebody, then that's what you're not going to be like, oh, well, go to Kitsune over here, and because she's the master typo fixer or something like that. I still think that the collaboration, that the ability to work with folks in some kind, be it virtual or in person, that's what builds those bonds. That's what builds the strength of these communities. And I think that's going to be true going on, even if ChatGPT is out there acting like somebody else, unless it's like constantly, unless you just have like deep fake Jake out there, like contributing to this thing. And then, hey, guess what? If those contributions are worthwhile, then does it really matter? I guess if it produces value, maybe that's okay. I don't know.
So you almost get the point where somebody raises a pull request with typo fixes, and then you just put a comment on there, and then if they don't bother commenting back, then it's a spam job and you just close it. Whereas if they coming back and say, oh yes, I'm actually a copy editor, I've had a lot of fun doing this, blah blah blah, you've got that relationship, got that collaboration that you talked about. But yeah, when they just submit it and then they go away, then we don't care. We don't want to deal with that. Maybe not don't care, but we don't want to deal with it. Yeah. Cool. Any more questions in the room here? Yeah. Okay. One more.
All right. Throw the mic. No,
so what are some of the tips you have in terms of keeping your open source developers motivated, especially in the beginning phase, or maybe you have some adoption, but maybe developers are starting to get tired of that free contribution to your project? Do you have any tips in terms of how do we continue to motivate the developers to continue committing to that project?
That's a really good question. Who wants to take this one first? Oh,
nice. So my focus around open source has generally been more around the people. So how do you get people to be excited about this? How do you get the energy driven into the project? How do you align interests so that people get benefits from participating in the project? How do you allow for a contributor to grow within a project through maybe status or through skilling or through just the community, the connections, the potential recruiting opportunities, like all of these things? If you are building the on-ramps into your project and out of your project and around your project with all of these things in mind, then you have mentorship rings, you have the ability to help those people grow within the community to a position of leadership, which then potentially may help them get jobs. So you find ways that participation benefits each individual. So it's not just I give you all of this and I get nothing back. So there has to be some sort of reciprocation in this, and there has to be some way that the community and the contributor engagement is matched up with what those contributors need or want from that community and that growth in their career.
So I've got a bit of a question based off that then. So the open source bootcamp we run here, we have a regular mentor who comes and helps out. Apollo is a GitHub campus expert at UW. and he was using Swift. He wanted to get QR codes in Swift because he didn't have it. He ended up making that contribution to the Swift project, and then from there he got an internship at Apple working on Swift, which is absolutely fantastic. But how do you scale that? You know, that's great for one developer, and you've kind of got that nurture stream for one developer. But if you've got 10 developers, 20 developers, how do you scale that motivation out? You know, one-on-one mentoring time doesn't scale.
Well, I think there's two pieces. I mean, and Sarah knows this because she basically lived this for the Kubernetes community. You know, and I think but I would say that I think that there's two pieces. One is you have to scale the community part of the community, right? And so you have to give the people who are excited about the community, maybe more than the code, the opportunity to become core members of the project, core people who drive the project forward. So, you know, we created a group of people in the Kubernetes community who are oriented around contributor experience and how do we make the first pull request really great, and how do we make the next, and I think that helps with the scaling because now you have 5 people that are interested in it, not just one person who's interested in it. I think the other thing that I would emphasize a lot is distributed ownership. And I think, again, the Kubernetes community did a really, really good job, very intentionally at the start, where we were like, no offense to Guido, but like not big fans of the benevolent dictatorship model of open source. And so we very purposely gave away a lot of power at the beginning, and then we very purposely sharded the power. So it was like, we're not going to have a dictator, but then also we're going to identify individual places where people can become owners. You can be the owner of Node, or you can be the owner of disks, or you can be the owner of, or you can be a tech lead. And we identified a whole bunch of different kinds of roles that could enable people to take personal ownership and believe that this project was theirs. And I think that's the other part of how you scale, is that people stay motivated. Sure, if their career is getting better, sure, if, you know, they're excited about the project, but if they feel like it's their project and that kind of their pride is on the line, they will stick around even more. And not just stick around because you've trapped them, but actually stick around because they want to see this thing succeed. And so I think that's another, I mean, when you look at how, I don't think, I mean, it sounds like I'm tooting our horn up here, but like, I don't think another open source project has scaled the way we did. And I think it's because of how we structured it.
Yeah, and I mean, we have a slightly different model, but also there's such a wide amount of folks, you know, certainly in the Terraform community, and even in some of the other product communities as well. The recognition comes in a couple different forms. Some is like ambassadorship so we have open source ambassadors who are folks who have been just working on this stuff for a long time. You know, we actually hire folks that have been, you know, big contributors within our software project because they have shown that they have a proficiency. They've shown that they have a desire, and we're scaling out as a company. And so we have room to hire some of these folks into these projects. And then because there's lots of like other, you know, sort of areas around open source tooling, we're seeing actually a lot of folks who are creating open source alternatives even to like our enterprise offerings that are out there. And while, you know, somebody like a JPMC may not adopt those, there's other folks that are just like, hey, you know, we can adopt this because it's, you know, we have a small team, we can do these things. And not only that, now you have this kind of prestige and recognition. And then those folks, you know, who knows whether we would acquire somebody like that because they're, you know, they to a certain extent, you know, compete with what we have. But there is some prestige that's in there within those communities, within those ambassadors, within the folks that are sharing. They come to the conferences, they talk about all the cool stuff that they do. And that recognition, this comes back to this whole thing about the community building. You know, you're not getting a chat GPT, you know, that particular developer that's doing all these cool things because that it lacks the context to know that there's a need for that. It's the humans that would use that to like generate the stuff that they need. And sure, they may get prestige by, you know, sort of wrapping that in there. But, you know, the cool thing is like we can recognize those folks. Oh, sorry, I had like some stuff on the background. Was there a question there? Or maybe some feedback? Okay. anyways, so again, it's a slightly different model for us than maybe what happened with the Kubernetes community, but it's that recognition that the ability to rise up the prestige, to put those developers forward. And again, we see that within our communities as well. But it is back to that community. We have to take that time, and we're very committed to working with our community and making sure that folks get sort of promoted externally outside the company for their contributions and whatnot as well. So again, cornerstone is that that promotion side of stuff. And again, yeah, maybe we'll hire you. If you're really contributing that much, we'll have room for that.
It's kind of one of the classic motivational models of corporate is people work for two things: pay and praise. Now, as you talked about earlier, there is no pay in open source, but there is praise. So through having these kind of promotional activities, having ambassadors, a hero program, something like that, where you recognize the efforts people are doing, you celebrate the community, that is the motivation that they need to carry on their contributions.
Status, access, power, stuff. Those are the 4 classic gamification motivators. And that works in any open source community. Whether it's status, I now become a lead of a sub project, or access, I get to talk to Brendan. Or power, I can make this decision for the node group. And I just knocked my glasses off. Or stuff, it's swag. It's the specialty t-shirt that is a logo that is artistically drawn for a specific event that you were at, that you can then trade and tell stories with your community with. Like, this is about lore, and this is about engagement, and this is about building the next generation within each of these projects. When Brendan and I were building what we refer to as the bootstrap steering committee, we don't have anything to derive power from. How are we going to decide how we make these decisions? When we were working through that, one of the big questions we asked was, how do we make sure that there are multiple generations of leaders, and that every time we are looking to move someone out because they maybe are working on a new project, that there is a person who has been brought forward and has been working as a leader in that project and who can step into that role as a leader. So you're always working to bring someone up along behind you.
Was that another question? Okay. So you kind of got that succession planning model, in which you have to have that in there for the project to keep on going. Awesome. Just flipping over to the YouTube chat here. If you're watching online, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. But Main Digit says, great that you bought the idea of collaborating with quality of commits rather than number of commits. Yeah, I think it's a big thing. It's not about a numbers game. I know there was a recent roasting on Twitter where somebody said, don't apply to be a senior dev if you've only got 1 green square on your GitHub profile, which is a terrible thing to say. Yes, it's not about the number of commits, it's about the quality of the work that you're doing. Okay, another question in the room? No, because the microphone is what gets routed online.
So my question is, how do you balance one-way relationship between the open source community and the people who get advantage from it?
Okay. Okay.
Could you repeat that?
The question. So the question was, how do you balance the sort of one-way relationship between the people who maintain the open source project and the people who gain benefit from it? By which I think you mean, I'm going to interpret the question a little bit, but I think by which you mean the fact that 99.9% of the people who use an open source project don't contribute to that open source project. And I guess and it's sort of, I guess, a little bit of a flip answer, but you just live with it. Like, that is the ratio, right? And I think anytime, like, we talk to people who are going to go do an open source project, and I think sometimes they have this impression that they're going to, like, every user is going to suddenly start filing high quality bug reports and code with fixes. And you're just like, yeah, that's just not going to happen. And I think, we build open source projects with that in mind. We build open source projects that, if you're lucky, 10 out of every 100 users will file an issue, and maybe 1 out of every 100 will actually give you some code, and then maybe even less than that is going to stick around for multiple iterations of code. And even if you stick around, you might leave after 6 months, right? And that's just the reality of open source. And I don't think it's a bad thing, actually. Like, I've done plenty of drive-by commits, and I think that the communities that I contributed to are probably better for it. I don't necessarily consider myself a member of those communities now because I did a drive-by commit, but I think that's okay.
Anyone else? Any comments on that?
Yeah,
Joe?
I mean, not really. I agree with what he's saying. There is there is that reality that not everybody's going to do that. But I mean, I think that's that's true of like demand, and it comes back to that motivation thing. I think there's just some folks who just intrinsically want to, like, build things and fix things. If it's a drive-by commit, hey, I see a need that's there, and it's sort of like it's an itch, and you just have to scratch it, and that's how you scratch the itch, and that's that particular personality they have. And I agree. Not everybody is builders, not everybody's fixers or what are that are out there, but there are certain people they're just going to naturally gravitate towards those things, and then there's going to be a lot of people that just use the thing. And I think I agree with that. I think it's just okay to accept that. I mean, it doesn't seem like it's falling apart given the distribution of what it is that we have. It's actually growing stronger. Based off on that model. It's sort of interesting is that there's nobody governing open source in the greater sense of anything. There's not like a regulatory commission that's making sure that open source is okay. It just kind of does it on its own, and it seems like it does its own, and we're still creating really cool stuff because of it. So it seems I don't feel like it's that broken. There's little broken pieces, obviously, but the vast majority of it seems like it's in pretty good health.
So I've got an extension of that question, actually. Just think back to the open source boot camps we run here at the Reactor every kind of few months. We want to get people to the point where they can contribute to an open source project. And every time we've tried over a weekend to actually get somebody to make a contribution, we failed because the onboarding ramp for projects is hard. So if you're brand new to open source, how do you get started with Kubernetes, for example? What is that onboarding ramp, and what can open source projects do to reduce that barrier to entry so new people can make those drive-by commits?
Yeah, so I mean, from my personal experience, I'm trying to think of the most recent drive-by commit that I did. But I think that there's a couple different things that I would highlight. One is good issue curation. So like saying, hey, this is a good first issue. And I don't think a lot of people do necessarily a great job of doing that, but I think that's one really big thing is help people find out. Because I've definitely seen times when people are like, how about this issue? It looks like it's really old. And you're like, yeah, that one's old for a reason. And then I think the other thing that I would hype a lot actually is dev containers, which is something that GitHub and VS Code worked on together, where if you check in a .dev containers folder into your repo, someone in VS Code or in GitHub Codespaces can immediately jump in with all the right tools installed, with all the right language runtimes, and just CI/CD ready to go, like do all of that stuff. Because like oftentimes for me anyway, the biggest challenge is like, oh, do I really want to install that language that I don't use and those 20 different library dependencies onto my machine and forget about them and then wonder my disk is full and all this kind of stuff. And dev containers just has really transformed for me anyway, my ability to just jump immediately into the environment as the maintainers want the environment to be, make a quick PR, run it through the CI/CD and move on, right? So
I'll add one further bit to that, which is just remember that there is no community except that the community that you build and set up to foster. So dev containers is a great example of this. Good first issue is a great example. Office hours for your from your maintainers for a particular set of questions is a great way to handle this. Now, being able to answer questions for people, but the key bit for me, and I refer to it always as mean time to dopamine. So it's basically how quickly can I get to that, oh, that was cool moment, whatever it was, whether it was the CI/CD system worked and all the tests were green, or it was I found that first issue and it's a thing I can attach. And oh, by the way, here's really good documentation about how to set up or engage with my first commit. So like that work, that investment up front to try to make it easier for a new contributor has to happen. Like that is what brings people in. It's not that, there are some savants out there who suddenly can look at any repo and go, oh, this is how I commit here.
It's that instant gratification. We need to be able to get that instant hit of get it working. Jake, any thoughts?
Yeah. As long as it's not Confluence, I think I'm sorry, we use it, but yeah. Dev containers over Confluence. I think that's probably the way to go.
Cool. Okay, we have another question in the room.
All right. So we know some open source projects become huge, like the Kubernetes project. What are some other things that set them apart from the ones that don't actually get to that level? I know we've mentioned some of them, like like Brandon, or some of them like fostering the community, making it easy for that first commit, things like that. But what are some of the other things that made projects like Kubernetes project? It pretty much took on Docker, right? Like Docker, offerings for container orchestration. And I think Docker obviously came before Kubernetes. So what are some of the things about Kubernetes project, for example, that made it so successful?
That's a great question, I guess.
Kelsey Hightower and Brandon. No, I'm just kidding.
It is. I mean, no, actually, I do actually want to give a really serious shout out to Kelsey. Someone earlier mentioned Mitchell pounding the pavement for Vagrant.
Yeah.
Pounding the pavement is 100% part of it, right? And I don't think Kelsey wrote a single line of code in Kubernetes in the beginning. And I will say, in all honesty, the project would not exist in its current form and success without what he did, right? And I think it's a real testament to the fact that advocacy, evangelism, telling the story, like, he's just an amazing storyteller, and telling that story makes a huge difference. But I will also say that, getting back to what we talked about earlier, giving everybody a reason that they could win, a reason that if this thing won, they would win, right, was a huge part of it, right? And I think all good platforms go by that. Like, for every dollar I make, somebody else makes 10, right? And I think that's the other piece. It doesn't have to be money, but you have to get people to believe that they will win if your thing wins, right? And I think we did a really good job of that, about like letting making it a true open ecosystem, and not anointing kings, and like all of this stuff that really helped us have a lot of shared victories. So, but I think there's also, I guess what I would also say is, like, I think there's a little confirmation bias also, right? Like, sometimes you just win because you're the one who won. And then people are like, how did you win? And it turns out, well, maybe it was, like, the right time and luck, and like, the right, so like, I think we did a lot of things right, but I also think that reverse engineering it sometimes is a little bit tricky, because somebody had to, sort of like somebody had to win. I don't know. Yeah.
But there was a huge demand for that kind of a thing, right? So for folks who've done operations for any length of time, we're banging our heads on the fact that, there's all these dependency issues that were largely solved by the containers, and without containers, they're, like, Kubernetes isn't necessarily as interesting, right? Because it solved a lot of like portability issues. Like, how do I ship this thing from place to place? How do I quickly iterate on standing up infrastructure and spreading it out across a fleet of servers? Like, there were primitives we could do within that environment, but that demand of what we were solving, that next generation of operational issues that we'd seen from the next iteration of something like Borg into the community project of Kubernetes, like that, it scratched an itch that everybody had. And I think that a lot of these successful open source projects, they actually solve a need that lots of people have. And, like, Terraform's a great thing. Like, I want to be able to provision infrastructure with a similar language across a wide variety of things. Like, even though that we promoted that product, I think just the brand of what it was from HashiCorp, from the evolution from Vagrant into something like Terraform, helped to launch that a lot quicker. And we didn't necessarily need somebody like Kelsey to make Terraform there, because we'd already started building that capabilities with something like Vagrant, and people understood this is sort of like Vagrant for the cloud. But as an operator, like, when somebody told me about Kubernetes the first time, I was like, sign me up. And then 2 years later, we we finally got to production. But I think the interesting thing about that, and is that a lot of people realized that there was a bunch of different problems within the Kubernetes space and solved it. Like, I don't know how many people wrote Helm to begin with, but when Helm came out, we're like, oh crap, we wrote that and we didn't do as good of a job. So let's just use Helm, or, sort of insert other accelerated tools that we have here. And I think that's the thing, is like, you find the most amount of pain that you can solve in an elegant way, and like your project's going to blow up and it'll probably be successful. I would hope so anyways.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point about the sort of like, a lot of people don't care whose project wins. They just want the one that is going to do the best job for that undifferentiated heavy lifting, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you can be the one that either does the best job or is the most welcoming or has the best docs or whatever, like they're just going to choose you, not because you're awesome, but just because they have a job to do. Mm-hmm. And they want to check that box and move on, right? And I think there's a certain amount of that too. Like once we got over a certain point, like people are just like, oh, that's just the choice. Check, done. Let me go build some AI. Yeah.
So I guess comes to the luck thing. There's the old thing that the more work you put in, the luckier you get. So the more effort you put into the project, the more chance you have of being the lucky one that takes it there. I think you're comment about docs as well. Docs are hugely important. I was reading recently about the JavaScript CSS framework space. I'm not a web person, so I get confused by all the different things. But I was reading that Tailwind is kind of being the clear winner at the moment, simply because the docs are the best. So if you don't document the feature, it doesn't exist. Doesn't matter how much time you put into it. If it's not documented, it doesn't exist. So without good docs, you cannot be lucky. You could never be a successful project if people do not know how to use it. So by investing that time in docs, you're increasing your luck, I would say. Okay, any more questions from the room? No. Okay. Online, I'm not seeing any more questions come through online. So I will just wrap up with one last quick-fire question for all three of you. Start with you, Jake. What's your favorite open source project? The one that brings you the most joy?
Obviously I'm biased because we're big Terraform folks. I'm like super stoked about Terraform just in general. But obviously it's from a HashiCorp side of things. I'm just gonna stick with that. It's a little bit of a punt, but I've just loved to see what's happened within the community and with what people are creating. You can order Domino's pizza with Terraform. It's probably not the right way to do it, but people do funky things, and it's I dig it. So yeah, Terraform.
Anything you order pizza with is probably a good project. Okay, Brendan.
I'm gonna have to say that the project that I've been unable to put down lately has been the WebAssembly runtime from the Bytecode Alliance. I started kicking on that. It's I don't always get addicted to like writing code, and this is one where I was just like, I'm falling asleep, but I still want to keep hacking on my laptop, and so that's been kind of fun because it's been a little bit since I've done that. So that's what I've been focusing a little bit on lately.
I'll reference the Open Docs project because I think docs is actually super important. And then the way that I led a documentation team at Google for a while, and the way that good documentation writers approach docs is completely different from the way that an average engineer might write a thing. And Open Docs actually gives you some of that framework, and then also builds a community around documenting open source projects.
Awesome. Thank you. And I will just mention one that brings me joy has got to be VS Code Pets. If you've not seen VS Code Pets, so it's an open source extension. Anthony Shaw, who's a Python developer advocate at Microsoft, when he joined, the first thing he did is he built a pets add-in for Visual Studio Code. It's all open source, so you bring up a little pane and you can add like a cat or a dog, and it just runs around. You can drop a ball in and bounce the ball around. So you all have to install VS Code Pets. If you don't have VS Code Pets, you all have to install it. Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here. So thank you, Jake, for joining us remotely. Thank you, Brendan and Sarah, for joining us in the room. Thank you, everyone who came along to this session. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. This is going to be recorded. It'll be on YouTube. So if you've got any more questions, please put it in the YouTube chat, and we can route those questions to the right people and try and get you some more answers. But otherwise, thank you for joining this event at the Microsoft Reactor. Round of applause for our guests. Woo!
Thanks, everyone.